we're making a sphere, and we're going to be painting like a sphere, and we're going to do some shadow, and there's that shadow coming off to the side and everything. You remember there were those lines coming this way, and I want to kind of recreate and talk about what it is we're actually seeing there. Okay, so I'm just going to undo that. Usually, one good way to think about this is the sun. You know, our star. I'm just going to kind of draw like this. Can you see this is the sun? It's hard to spell with the mouse. This is the sun. So you may not be aware of like the size of the Earth in relative to the sun. You know, I'm drawing the sun huge. Like if you were to think of this sun, keep going. So the sun is just a giant sphere. Um, and if I were to put Earth, you know, it's going to be far away from the sun, and I'll just put it here. And you know, this dot is probably going to be too big, but you know, it's hard to see that little dot there. But that's what I just painted there. I'll make it a little bit bigger so you can see it. This is Earth. It's just a really small dot. Um, I'm zoomed out in a weird way there. And so it's a very small dot, and that's actually too big relative to the sun. That's actually quite a large planet, but let's just keep it that size, just because it's a little easier to see. Um, so the sunlight coming off, you know, usually you see a picture of the sun, someone usually draws like a circle, and then you see these lines coming out, like kind of like radiating out from the sun, and it's a good way to represent the sun because it's showing what we're seeing is the light emanates in all directions off of a star, and they all come off at perpendicular to the surface. Okay. And that's the same with our sun, you know, our star. We're really close to the this particular star, and so our light hits us pretty quickly. But you'll see that, say, the light coming from this part of the sun is going to go out this way, and the light from this part of the sun is going to go out, say, maybe this way, right? And you can see it doesn't even hit us. This part of the sun is not hitting our planet at all. It's just going straight out away from our planet. But then there's a little bit that's right here, and it's going to come straight. It's going to hit us. And so one of the things that we think of when we talk about the sun is that it's straight. Spell straight wrong. Look at that. Is it G? That's straight. Probably spelled that wrong, right? It's parallel. So sometimes the way we would represent sunlight and digitally will be something like this. It's usually 3 lines that have arrows, I guess. Usually represent it like this. So the digital representation of sunlight would look something like this. So if you were to present a light in some special software that's acting in the way of the sun, it'll look like that. It usually has 3 lines parallel to one another, and that's a good representation of what light is doing. So the point being is that light is straight coming from a planet. And when I talked about that image in the class, so I think, let's see if I can get to it going this way. No, not that one. This image here shows the light kind of conical. And that's what I was saying is that if you're using a light bulb, the light is so close to the object, the sphere, that you actually can catch the angles. So if I had a sphere that was this big, it makes sense that the light would be coming conically because, say, you know, I have a light bulb and I have like a basketball next to a light bulb. I'm going to get a conical light source. So that's going to be a different type of light. So if we are talking about uh, a light bulb, our shadows are going to respond in a different way than they will with the sunlight. And so it's a real important thing to remember. And we make this point in talking about this because later on you're maybe going to take some photographs and you're going to want to figure out how shadows are working in those photographs, and depending on whether it's daylight or indoor light, it's going to change the way your shadows work. And you really want to think about understanding the relationship to the conical nature of light and how that's going to make shadows stretch if it is conical. So just watch out for that. That's something to pay attention to. So you don't have to do this, but I'm actually going to do something a little bit fancy. I'm going to well, let's just leave those there. Let's just leave this layer here and call this lines. Okay. In fact, actually, let's rename this. Let's rename this layer. Let's call this sun. Okay. This is our sun layer, and this is going to help us sort of understand sort of the direction of the sunlight. Okay. Now, that's pretty much most of the tools. So we talked about the layers. We talked about a selection tool. We've talked about our brush tool. Now, I did mention we'll talk about the blur, but this doesn't make sense to talk about quite yet. But let's talk about our last set of tools that are going to help us build this, and that's going to be the transform tools. Let's take a look at it. So our sun layer is sitting here right now. Let's go and take a look at Edit, Transform. And there's two kinds of transforms. If you notice, if I go to Transform, I get all these settings here that I can pick from. Or I have this free transform, and I typically prefer the free transform. I like it because it has the key command and it's really easy to grab, and I remember this key command really easy and use it a lot. And transform is something that we do a really lot in Photoshop. So again, it's a really powerful tool and it's really useful to know. I think sometimes people really like to see what they're doing to begin with. In my experience, it's been helpful for people to do that. I will always go to free transform though. So when you start getting more used to it, you'll start to see this. But let's just work with transform to begin with. And I'm going to just kind of really only work with scale and rotate today. But you can see that there's actually quite a bit of things that we can do. But let's work with rotate. Zoom back out. When you get into one of these tools, what you'll notice is that you'll get these little handles, like these little squares on the edges of the selection. And then if you come near these, you'll start to see, you get these icons. And this particular icon, when you see this little turned arrow like that, bending in 90 degrees, this means rotate. Yeah, because I went into transform rotate, the only thing I can do right now is rotate. So it's important though to start recognizing how these icons sort of change, and especially when we're using free transform, because it helps us understand what the tool is going to do. But I can only rotate here, so there's not too much to really think about with this tool. Sorry, I just zoomed out the wrong way. And so what I want to do is I'm going to mimic, I'm going to rotate this sun so it's pointed in the direction that we want it to point in. So I'm going to take this and rotate it like this. And I'm just matching that image that we were just looking at. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the sun and see how the sun's pointed over here. I'm just going to take it. I'm just going to put these arrows. I don't need to see the back part of the sun there. I'm just going to take the arrows. I'm just going to put them up there so I can see them. Right? And because we're so far away, it doesn't really matter where you put those arrows. That's the direction the sun's going to be going. So these other lines that are sort of out there kind of pointing in the other direction. Let's not think about those. Let's just put it like this, so we just see those straight lines like that. So this is the direction of the light, and it would be the same no matter where we go. It's always going to be pointed this direction. And we're just sort of defining that where the sun is. So we'll say it's right up here. You can play with that direction, and it's more of a visual and to help you understand how this sort of thing works. 'Cause sometimes people never really, they don't always describe the method by which you do a sphere. Sometimes it's just about light and shadow. So what you'll notice is when you use a transform tool, so we went to edit transform, when you use the transform tool, you get these options at the top. So remember, we're in a tool, so you'll see that it's actually showed me how far I just rotated, which was 128 degrees. And notice I wasn't using numbers, I just did it visually looking at the screen. But these two are really important. If we hit the check mark, that's going to commit the transform. That's going to keep the rotation. And if I hit the little crossed out circle, it's going to cancel the transform. So I want to keep this transform, so I'll go ahead and hit the check mark, and it accepts. And now this is positioned in such a way that it's rotated now going this direction. So now the sun's coming from the top right-hand corner. Getting into the transform tools, it's important to notice that when we're transforming, you notice there isn't really a move, right? There's scales, rotate, skew, distort. Again, you don't see anything here that says move, okay? And so they have it's such a common thing to do. It's so common to move something that they actually have that particular transform tool somewhere else. So let's show you where that is. It's actually right at the very top, and it's right here, move tool. And so sometimes that throws people off, like, well, where's the move on the transform? Like it's not there, and it's actually something that we do so commonly that it's just one of the top main tools that you can possibly click on. It moves a lot of different ways. And it moves a little bit differently. It doesn't have the you don't enter into it. You don't accept it or escape from it. So it has some unique qualities that are a little bit different than the transform tools. You'll see if I click on it, there is an artboard tool. We're not going to worry about that. That's going to be if you really get into the business, you're going to maybe think about stuff like that for graphic design or whatever. Right? Could be web design or something, but we're just using move tool. I have noticed that sometimes I come to some students and they have this button selected, show transform controls, and it will then show the tools just like you were seeing before, and I can actually do some rotations and stuff by having that on. So there are some people that really love doing that. I kind of don't have that on usually, although it's more of a preference thing. But if you find yourself doing a lot of transforming, you might really want to have that on. I use the Control T or the Command T to do my transforms rather than use the show transform controls. So I don't know if that's by default on for some students or not, but I run into this a lot with people that this turned on. I would leave it off for now, just so that you can get used to the process. We're going to use the transform tools in different ways, and we can really access all the same qualities without having that on. And I think later on, as you use Photoshop, this might actually become kind of problematic. Not terribly, but as long as you know what you're doing, you'll make your own decisions about that. The other setting to pay attention to probably is auto select. Right now we'll leave that on, but this can be really annoying at times. This is something that sometimes I like to have it on and sometimes I like to have it off. It really sort of depends on what process I'm working on at any given time. but sometimes it can be really difficult, especially with line art, a lot of lines. This can be really challenging and not really a good thing to have turned on, but for right now, I think it's perfect, and we'll just leave it on. So I think by default, actually, it's set up the way I like it. I didn't really have to click anything here, but I just want to point out that there are some uh, menu items up at the top, even with the move tool, that you might want to consider looking at over time. So those are the main tools, the main things to look at in terms of just setting up a project. So, the layers, creating a layer. We just made one layer, we deleted a layer. We talked about the difference between a background layer and a regular layer. We talked about the selection tool, the marquee selection tool, and how to utilize the marquee selection tool to select out portions to either paint in or delete. We click to use the marquee selection tool to deselect or select. We also can use the select area up here for deselect. We talked about the paintbrush, and we were mostly interested in size, softness, and hardness, and even though we haven't used opacity and flow quite yet, we will. We were going to talk about the blur tool, but we haven't gotten to that point yet, so we'll talk about that in a moment. And then we talked about the transform tools, right? So we were going into the edit transform tools. We're using the rotate. Maybe later we'll use a little bit of scale. And then we made a special note that we don't have move here in our transforms. So technically a move would be a transform, but that is right here, and it's at the top of our tool palette called the move tool, and that allows us to move things. So I can now move these arrows around, and that's just the regular move tool, not rotating but just moving them. So lastly, we just kind of talked about the sun and light a little bit, just so we can have that as a kind of a little bit of a understanding about what we're doing. So I'm going to stop here and just stop this video, and then run it one more, and we'll actually take advantage of all these tools now and paint out a sphere real quick. So we'll stop here, take a little break, and then we'll come back and we'll do the painting of a sphere.